December 27th, 1941, 6:45 in the morning. The coast of occupied Norway, the fjord at Vågsøy, is wrapped in pre-dawn darkness, and the air temperature has dropped well below freezing. Sleet is falling sideways off the North Sea, and the mountains on either side of the fjord are invisible behind low cloud. Somewhere ahead, through the murk, lies a small island called Melanie, barely half a mile long, where a German garrison of roughly 150 men is sleeping behind stone walls with machine guns and a battery of coastal artillery covering every approach from the water. Aboard a flat-bottomed Higgins boat grinding its way toward that shoreline, 40 British commandos are crouched against the gunwales with their weapons between their knees, their faces blackened with cork, their boots laced tight against the cold. The Bren gunners have already loaded their magazines. The demolition teams have primed their charges. Every man in the boat has rehearsed the landing sequence a dozen times on the west coast of Scotland, in conditions designed to be worse than anything the Germans could produce. They know the plan, they know the targets, they know the timing down to the minute. Naval destroyers are already in position behind them, waiting for the signal to begin the bombardment that will soften the German defences before the landing craft hit the beach. What none of them are entirely prepared for, even though several have seen it before, is what the man standing in the bow of the landing craft is about to do. He is a tall officer, lean and sharp-featured, with pale blue eyes that his men will later describe as unsettling in their intensity. He is 35 years old, though the lines on his face make him look older in the grey light. He is not crouching like the other men. He is standing fully upright, silhouetted against the sky, presenting a perfect target to anyone on the island, with a rifle and a steady hand. Slung across his back is a set of Highland bagpipes. On his left hip, hanging from a Sam Brown belt, is a Scottish basket-hilted broadsword, the kind of blade that had been out of place on a battlefield for generations. He has an M1 carbine somewhere in the boat behind him, and a 45 caliber automatic pistol on his belt, but those are not the weapons he intends to use first. As the landing craft clears the last 200 meters toward the shore, with shells from Royal Navy destroyers now hammering the German positions above the beach in plumes of orange fire and grey smoke, the officer unslings the bagpipes. He fills the bag, he sets his fingers on the chanter, and he begins to play. The tune is called March of the Cameron Men. It is a regimental march of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, the regiment whose pipe major had taught him to play a decade earlier on the other side of the world in a hill station in Burma. The sound carries across the freezing water, high and sharp above the deep concussion of the naval guns, cutting through the smoke, drifting off the bombardment craters on the beach. It is by any rational standard of modern warfare completely insane. A man standing upright in an open boat, playing bagpipes, sailing directly toward a defended enemy position in the middle of a combined forces assault. Every German soldier on Melanie who is still alive after the bombardment can see him. Every one of them can hear him. The ramp drops, the officer throws a grenade onto the beach. Then he draws the broadsword from its scabbard and charges up the shingle into the smoke. His name is John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. He holds the rank of second in command of No. 3 Commando. He is no relation whatsoever to the Prime Minister, though the surname will save his life 3 years from now in circumstances he cannot yet imagine. And by the time this war is over, he will have fought with a broadsword and bagpipes in France, Norway, Sicily, mainland, Italy, and the islands of the Adriatic. He will have won the Distinguished Service Order and a bar to the Distinguished Service Order. He will have been awarded the Military Cross. He will have captured 42 enemy prisoners in a single night with one other man. He will have been shot, shelled, blown up by grenades, captured, imprisoned in a concentration camp alongside men who survived the Great Escape, tunneled out of that camp, walked across 100 miles of enemy territory, been recaptured within sight of the Baltic Sea, and then escaped again months later from an SS convoy in the Austrian Alps. He will have walked 150 kilometres through the mountains to reach the Allied lines, and when the war in Europe ends, he will volunteer immediately to go fight the Japanese, only to have the atomic bomb rob him of the chance. His men call him Mad Jack, not because he is mentally unstable, not because he is reckless or stupid. Every officer who serves with him, every commando who follows him up a beach or through a darkened village street at 3 a.m. will say the same thing. He is precise. He is calculating. He is fearless in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen it. He is one of the most effective combat commanders in the British Army. He simply refuses, on a matter of personal and unshakable principle, to fight like a 20th century soldier. And that refusal, which should by all logic have gotten him killed in the first 5 minutes of his first engagement, instead becomes the most unlikely and most effective weapon in his entire arsenal. Because Mad Jack Churchill figured out something that the military manuals never taught and that the enemy never once learned to counter. In a war fought by millions of men carrying identical rifles and wearing identical uniforms and trained in identical doctrines, the thing that terrifies an enemy most is the thing he cannot categorize. The thing that does not fit inside any of the boxes his training has built for him. A man who fights with a medieval sword is not just unusual, he is inexplicable. And inexplicable, on a battlefield, is a form of power that no amount of conventional weaponry can match. This is the story of how one man, armed with a longbow, broadsword, and a set of bagpipes, compiled one of the most extraordinary combat records of the Second World War, and of why the weapons that should have been useless relics turned out to attack the one thing that bullets could not touch, the enemy's certainty about what kind of war he was fighting. To understand how a British officer ended up charging German machine gun positions with a sword and a set of bagpipes in the middle of the 20th century, you have to understand the man who chose those weapons and the life he had already lived before he ever went to war. Because Jack Churchill did not become eccentric when the fighting started. He had been building toward this his entire life. Every decision he made from boyhood onward pointed toward a man who was simply incapable of doing things the way everyone else did them, and who had decided, long before the first shots were fired, that the conventional way was not necessarily the right way, and was almost certainly not the interesting way. He was born on September 16th, 1906, in Colombo, Ceylon, what is now Sri Lanka. His father, Alec Fleming Churchill, was a civil engineer in the colonial service, part of a family long settled at Deddington, in Oxfordshire. Jack had 2 younger brothers. Thomas, born in 1907, would follow him into the Manchester Regiment and then into the Commandos, and eventually rise to the rank of Major General, proving that whatever was in the Churchill blood, it ran deep. Robert, the youngest, born in 1911, would join the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm and be killed in action off Malta in 1942 at the age of 30. The war that gave Jack Churchill his purpose took his youngest brother from him. He never spoke publicly about it. That was not the kind of man he was. But the fact that he fought on, harder and more recklessly than before, through 1943 and 1944, with a dead brother behind him and a sword in his hand, is worth remembering when people call him an eccentric who treated the war as a game. He knew what it cost. He paid the price himself. The family moved to Hong Kong when Jack was 4 years old, when his father was appointed Director of Public Works, and returned to England in 1917. Churchill was educated at the Dragon School in Oxford, and then at King William's College on the Isle of Man, before entering the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, where he graduated in 1926. He was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment, one of the oldest line infantry regiments in the British Army, and his first posting was to the 2nd Battalion at Rangoon in Burma. It was in Burma that 2 things happened that would define the rest of his life. The first was that he got bored, not the ordinary boredom of a young subaltern in a peacetime garrison, counting the days until the next leave. A deeper boredom, almost existential, with the entire machinery of conventional military life, The drills, the paperwork, the inspections, the rigid hierarchy, the suffocating predictability of garrison routine. Churchill was a man who needed to be in constant motion, needed to be doing something that nobody else around him was doing, needed to push against boundaries that other men simply accepted. The peacetime army in the late 1920s offered him almost nothing to push against. He took a signals course at Pune. He rode a Zenith motorcycle 1,500 miles across India, crashing into a water buffalo at one point and pushing the machine across open sleeper railway bridges in Burma by walking along the rails. These were not the actions of a man who was settling into a career. These were the actions of a man looking for an exit. The second thing that happened in Burma was the bagpipes. Stationed at Mamio, he encountered the pipe major of the Cameron Highlanders and asked to be taught. This was unusual enough on its own. Churchill was English, not Scottish, born in Ceylon, raised partly in Hong Kong. The pipes were a fiercely guarded tradition of the Highland regiments, and an Englishman asking to learn them was, in the 1920s, roughly equivalent to an outsider asking to be initiated into a private club whose members had not invited him. But the pipe major agreed, and Churchill threw himself into learning with the same obsessive intensity he brought to everything he touched. He practiced until his neighbours in the officers' mess presumably wished they had not been born with ears. Within a few years, he was good enough to enter the military piping competition at the Aldershot Tattoo in 1938, where he placed second, reportedly the only Englishman in a field composed entirely of Scots. He also taught himself archery, not recreational archery, the kind that elderly vicars do at country fairs. Competition-level archery with an English longbow, the weapon that had decided the battles of Crécy and Agincourt 500 years earlier. He practiced with the same relentless focus he had brought to the bagpipes, and by the late 1930s he was skilled enough to represent Great Britain at the World Archery Championships held in Oslo, Norway in 1939. He placed 26th. It was not a particularly distinguished result, but the fact that he was there at all, an active duty army officer competing internationally with a medieval weapon, tells you everything you need to know about the direction his life was heading. By the time of the archery championships, he had already left the army once. In 1936, after a full decade of service, he resigned his commission and walked away. The peacetime military held nothing more for him. He drifted into a series of improbable civilian careers that read like the resume of a man actively trying to confuse his biographers. He sailed to East Africa and worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. He modelled for advertisements in London. He appeared in small roles in films, using his archery and piping skills as his calling card, the only qualifications he possessed that the film industry was willing to pay for. He had a part in The Thief of Baghdad, a lavish fantasy production released in 1940, where his ability to shoot a longbow with accuracy made him useful in a way that his ability to lead a platoon of infantry did not. He appeared in at least one other film as well, picking up small roles wherever his unusual skills were wanted. None of these jobs lasted, none of them were meant to last. He was a man moving through the civilian world the same way he had moved through the military one, restlessly, impatiently, waiting for the thing that would finally demand from him everything he had. He was, by any conventional measurement of success, a man who had failed to find his place. A former soldier with no fixed profession, no settled direction, and a collection of hobbies, archery, piping, motorcycling, that belonged to a previous century and served no obvious purpose in the one he was living in. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world that Jack Churchill had been restlessly searching for arrived at his doorstep. He went back to the army with the speed of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment his entire adult life. He rejoined the Manchester Regiment and deployed to France with the British Expeditionary Force. And he took with him the weapons he had spent a decade mastering. The longbow, the broadsword, the bagpipes, not as curiosities, not as theatrical props for entertaining the lads in the mess. As the tools he intended to carry into actual combat against the German army. Before we follow Churchill into France, it is worth pausing to understand the kind of military that would not only tolerate a man like this, but actively seek him out and give him command of one of its most elite fighting units. Because Churchill was not merely endured by the British Army, he was, in a very specific way, exactly the kind of officer that a particular branch of that army was being designed to attract. And the story of that branch begins not with Churchill himself, but with a catastrophe and a memo. The catastrophe was Dunkirk. In May and June 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was driven out of France by the German Blitzkrieg. Over 300,000 soldiers were evacuated from the beaches, but they left behind virtually all of their heavy equipment, their tanks, their artillery, their transport. The army was demoralised, under-equipped and facing the very real possibility of a German invasion of the British Isles. The nation was on the defensive, and everyone knew it. The memo came from the Prime Minister. Winston Churchill, the other Churchill, the one who was actually related to the Duke of Marlborough, wrote a note to his Chief of Staff, General Hastings Ismay, in June 1940, calling for the creation of what he described as specially trained troops of the hunter class who could develop a reign of terror along the enemy-occupied coasts. The concept was straightforward. Britain could not invade Europe. Not yet, probably not for years. But it could raid it. Small parties of highly trained, lethally skilled volunteers would cross the Channel or the North Sea, strike German installations, kill or capture enemy soldiers, destroy infrastructure, gather intelligence, and withdraw before the enemy could concentrate enough force to respond. Hit and run, butcher and bolt. Those were the Prime Minister's words. The concept was given a name borrowed from the Boer War, where small mobile units of Afrikaner fighters had tied down the entire British Army for 3 years. A staff officer named Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark proposed the idea and chose the name, drawing on the Boer commando tradition that had humiliated the British Empire 40 years earlier. These new units would be called Commandos. The Commandos were, from their founding, designed to be unlike any other formation in the British Army. They were composed entirely of volunteers. No man was conscripted or assigned. Every soldier had to apply, be interviewed, pass physical and psychological tests, and then survive the most brutal selection course in the British military at a training centre called Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands. The centre was run by a legendary instructor named Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, a man whose methods were simple, ruthless, and designed to produce soldiers who could operate independently, think on their feet, and fight at close quarters with a ferocity that no amount of conventional training could instill. Training was conducted with live ammunition. Rounds cracked overhead during assault courses. Explosives detonated at realistic distances during demolition exercises. The speed marches through the Scottish Highlands were brutal, covering enormous distances in full kit over terrain that would have broken a peacetime infantry battalion. Men trained in cliff assault, small boat handling, silent killing, demolitions, map reading by night, and close quarters combat with knives, clubs, and bare hands. They crossed rivers under fire. They abseiled down cliff faces in the dark. They learned to function in conditions of extreme cold, extreme fatigue, and extreme danger, because those were the conditions under which they would actually fight. Men who hesitated, men who froze, men who showed anything less than total commitment to violence at close quarters were returned to their units immediately. By the war's end, some 25,000 men had passed through Achnacarry. Not all of them made it. And those who did emerged as a breed apart from the rest of the army. The kind of man who survived Achnacarry and thrived in the Commandos was, almost by definition, not the kind of man who thrived in the conventional army. The Commandos attracted mavericks, risk-takers, natural fighters, men who chafed under the normal rules, men who needed a structure that would point their aggression at the enemy rather than trying to grind it out of them through parade ground discipline. The penalty for failure was not punishment in the ordinary military sense. It was something worse. It was 3 words: Return to unit. You were sent back to your old regiment with nothing to show for it and everyone knowing why. That threat, oddly enough, produced better discipline than any amount of formal punishment ever could, because the men who stayed had chosen to be there and would do anything to remain. This was the force that Jack Churchill had been born for, long before it existed. The moment he heard about the Commandos, he volunteered, but before the Commandos came into being, there was France. And in France, in the chaos and terror of the 1940 retreat, Churchill gave the first demonstration of what kind of soldier he intended to be. In May 1940, the German blitzkrieg smashed through the Allied lines in Belgium and northern France with a speed and violence that exceeded every prediction the French and British high commands had made. Panzer divisions punched through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse, and drove for the Channel coast, splitting the Allied armies in two and cutting off the British expeditionary force from its supply lines, its airfields, and any realistic hope of a counterattack. The British began their desperate fighting retreat toward the coast and the evacuation beaches at Dunkirk. Churchill was with the 2nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment, one of thousands of British units falling back through the fields and villages of the Pas-de-Calais region, fighting rearguard actions against German infantry and armour that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and had complete air superiority overhead. The Luftwaffe controlled the sky. German Stuka dive bombers screamed down on retreating columns with a sound that men who survived it never forgot. The roads were clogged with refugees and wrecked vehicles and the bodies of horses and men. On May the 27th, near a village called L'Épinette in the Pas-de-Calais, his company was engaged in a rearguard action against a German patrol. What happened next has become one of the most debated minor incidents of the 1940 campaign. Multiple popular accounts state that Churchill used his longbow in combat during this engagement, and the story is repeated in nearly every source that mentions his name. But Churchill himself later said that his bows had been crushed by a lorry during the retreat, and his own comrades in No. 2 Commando, who served alongside him for years afterward, later said they never saw him carry a bow on commando operations. The truth of L'Épinette may never be resolved with certainty. What is documented beyond any doubt is this: Churchill fought through the retreat with extraordinary courage and resourcefulness. He led what remained of his company out through German lines at night after their ammunition ran out. He was wounded during the fighting, carrying a bullet lodged in his shoulder for the rest of his life. He reached Dunkirk and was evacuated back to England. And the 4th Infantry Brigade War Diary reportedly recorded him on the beach at Dunkirk with his bow and arrows, an image that witnesses described as one of the most reassuring sights of that desperate week. If the world was ending around them, at least there was one man who appeared to be having a good time for his actions. During the retreat from France, Churchill was awarded the Military Cross. But France, for all its horror and loss and confusion, had done something unexpected for Jack Churchill. It had shown him that war, for all its brutality, was the arena he had been searching for his entire restless adult life. The conventional army had proved once again that it could not hold him, but the chaos of combat, the improvisation, the moments when doctrine broke down and only instinct and nerve remained, those were the moments he was made for. He wanted more. Specifically, he wanted the Commandos. He had heard about the new raiding force being assembled, the volunteers, the special training, the promise of small unit operations behind enemy lines, where individual initiative mattered more than regimental tradition. He wanted raids. He wanted to fight the war on his own terms with his own weapons at close quarters in the dark, on beaches and in village streets, where the man with the sword and the nerve to use it could make a difference that no amount of artillery could match. He volunteered and was accepted, serving first as second in command of No. 3 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, one of the original Commando commanding officers, and himself a formidable soldier. Which brings us back to the frozen fjord at Vågsøy, and the morning that turned Jack Churchill from an eccentric officer with unusual hobbies into a combat legend. Operation Archery was the code name for the raid on Vågsøy and the neighbouring island of Malani on December the 27th, 1941. It was a full combined operation, the first true tri-service raid of the war, involving the Royal Navy, the RAF, and a mixed commando force drawn primarily from No. 3 Commando with elements of No. 2 Commando. The strategic objective was significant, far beyond the tactical scale of the raid itself. The fish oil factories on Vågsøy were producing glycerin that was vital to the German explosives industry. Without glycerin, you cannot manufacture nitroglycerin. Without nitroglycerin, you cannot produce the high explosives that fill artillery shells, bombs, and torpedoes. Destroying the factories would remove a link in the chain that connected the Norwegian fishing industry to the German war machine. The coastal batteries on Malmi covered the sea lanes that German convoys used to move iron ore, troops, and supplies along the Norwegian coast, the vital shipping route that kept the German war economy supplied with Scandinavian raw materials. And beyond the immediate military objectives, there was a broader strategic purpose. A successful raid on Vågsøy would force the German High Command to divert troops from other fronts, particularly the Eastern Front, to garrison the entire length of the Norwegian coastline against future commando attacks. Every German soldier sitting in a bunker in Norway watching for commandos was a soldier not fighting in Russia. Churchill was responsible for leading the assault group onto Mauli Island itself. The naval bombardment began at dawn. HMS Kenya and several destroyers opened fire on the German positions, and the RAF laid a smokescreen along the shore. The landing craft went in, under cover of the shell fire, and the smoke engines roaring, spray breaking over the gunnels. It was at this point, as the boats closed the final 200 metres to the beach, that Churchill stood up in the bow and began to play March of the Cameron Men. The effect on the German defenders, by every account that survives from both sides, was real and measurable. Not because the music frightened them in any simple instinctive way. These were trained soldiers who had heard artillery and survived air raids and fought in conditions far worse than a commando landing. What the bagpipes did was something more subtle and more disruptive. They created a moment of incomprehension. A man playing music in an open boat, standing upright under fire, in the middle of a naval bombardment, was so far outside any tactical framework the German defenders possessed that it produced a brief but genuine failure of response. The brain registers the unexpected, tries to categorize it, fails, and in that fraction of a second, the man with the expected weapon, the man whose training has prepared him only for expected threats, loses his edge. Churchill threw a grenade as the ramp dropped and charged up the beach with the broadsword in his hand. The fighting on Mauli was fierce, but relatively brief. The commandos swept through the German positions, systematically clearing bunkers and stone buildings with grenades and submachine gun fire. Churchill was wounded during the fighting but refused to be evacuated. The raid as a whole was a significant military success. The commandos killed more than 120 German soldiers, took 98 prisoners, destroyed the fish oil factories and the coastal batteries, and returned to Britain with a complete copy of the German Naval Code and more than 70 Norwegian volunteers who chose to leave occupied Norway. Churchill's signal after the island was secured was characteristically terse: Maløy battery and island captured. Casualties slight, demolitions in progress. Churchill, Vågsøy made his reputation inside the commando community. Every man who had been on that beach, every sailor who had watched the landing from the deck of a destroyer, every intelligence officer who debriefed the returning commandos came away with the same conclusion. Jack Churchill was either the bravest man in the British Army or the maddest, and the distinction between those two categories was growing less clear by the month. What was beyond question was that he could fight. He could lead. And he had an instinct for the decisive moment, for the gesture or the action that tilted the balance of a firefight in ways that tactical manuals could not explain and that conventional officers could not replicate. What came next made his legend permanent. On the 1st of July 1942, Jack Churchill was given command of No. 2 Commando. His predecessor as commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, had been captured during the famous raid on the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire in March of that year and would later receive the Victoria Cross for his heroism there. Churchill was now responsible for one of the most battle-tested and aggressive fighting units in the entire British Army, and he intended to lead it exactly the way he had fought at Vågsøy, from the front. With a sword in his hand and a set of bagpipes slung over his shoulder. In the summer of 1943, No. 2 Commando deployed to the Mediterranean for the invasion of Italy. The Sicily campaign was already underway, and the Allies were preparing for the next great leap, the crossing to the Italian mainland. Operation Avalanche, the amphibious landing at Salerno, began on September 9, 1943. It was one of the most fiercely contested landings of the war. The Germans had anticipated the assault, and the landing force came ashore into prepared defences, heavy artillery fire, and determined counterattacks that threatened to push the Allies back into the sea in the first critical hours. No. 2 Commando landed at the small coastal village of Marina di Vietri, south of Salerno, with orders to secure the critical high ground controlling the mountain passes that led inland from the beachhead. The terrain was nightmarish for an attacker, steep, rocky hillsides dotted with stone villages that gave the defenders natural fortresses at every turn. German observation posts on the hilltops above the passes had a clear view of the beaches below and were directing devastating mortar and artillery fire onto the landing zones with pinpoint accuracy. Every hour those posts remained operational, more men died on the sand and in the surf below. The passes had to be cleared, and they had to be cleared fast before the entire beachhead was compromised. Churchill took a single corporal, a man named Ruffle, and went forward into the village of Pigoletti, which was occupied by a substantial German force. What followed was one of the most audacious small unit actions of the entire Italian campaign, and possibly of the entire war. Working through the village in the darkness, building by building, street by street, Churchill and Ruffle began taking prisoners. Churchill's method was characteristically unorthodox and depended on a psychological insight that a more conventional officer would never have risked. He captured the first German sentry and then used that prisoner as a combination of shield and calling card. He marched the captured man to the next German position and demanded, in a voice loud enough to carry through the walls, that the occupants surrender immediately. His logic, which he explained to his men afterward with evident satisfaction, was straightforward. As long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, and if you are senior to him, he will obey. Position by position, room by room, cellar by cellar, 2 British soldiers worked their way through an entire village held by dozens of enemy troops. The audacity of it was almost as effective as the execution. No German soldier in Pigoletti, woken from sleep or dragged from a guard post in the middle of the night by an English officer with a sword on his hip and an air of absolute authority, could quite believe what was happening. And in the gap between what they expected and what they were experiencing, their will to resist collapsed. It was a masterclass in the psychology of surprise, conducted in the dark by a man who understood intuitively that confidence projected with enough conviction is its own form of firepower. When dawn came, and the rest of No. 2 Commando moved forward to consolidate the position, the count was extraordinary. 42 prisoners, including a complete mortar crew with all their equipment. Churchill made the prisoners carry their own weapons and their own wounded back to the British lines on carts and stretchers, a sight he himself described with considerable pleasure as something from the Napoleonic Wars. His commanding officers recommended him for the Victoria Cross. The recommendation was, as sometimes happened, downgraded to the Distinguished Service Order. Churchill accepted the DSO without visible disappointment. He did, however, go back into Pigoletti alone after the action was over, to retrieve his broadsword, which he had lost somewhere during the night's fighting. When he encountered a bewildered American patrol on the way back, and they asked him what on earth the lone British officer was doing, walking around in territory that was still not fully secured. He told them he was looking for his sword and that he would not be coming back for it a bloody third time. From Italy, Churchill's war moved east to the Adriatic. Operating from the island of Vis, the only Adriatic island that the Germans had not managed to capture, No. 2 Commando entered a different kind of war. Vis was a forward operating base, a rocky outpost in the Adriatic Sea from which small raiding parties could be launched against the chain of German-held islands stretching down the Dalmatian coast of occupied Yugoslavia. The Commandos worked alongside Marshal Josip Broz Tito's Yugoslav partisans, men and women who had been fighting the German occupation since 1941 and who brought local knowledge, ferocious motivation, and a willingness to take casualties that sometimes startled even the battle-hardened British commandos. The partnership was uneasy at times, but effective. The partisans knew the islands. The commandos had the training, the weapons, and the naval support to hit targets that the partisans could not take alone. Churchill's operational philosophy during this period was disarmingly simple. Attack as often as possible. He meant it. No. 2 Commando launched raid after raid, hitting German garrisons on islands across the Adriatic, never allowing the enemy to settle into a defensive routine, never giving them time to predict where the next blow would fall. On March 19, 1944, Churchill led a combined force of British commandos and American operations groups in an assault on the German garrison occupying Ulta Island. The attack was a complete success. The entire German garrison, consisting of 1 officer and 108 other ranks, was killed or captured. Churchill's own party took 34 prisoners, including the garrison commander. For the Ulta action, he was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order, making him one of a small number of officers in the British Army to hold the DSO and bar. But the Adriatic would also be the place where Churchill's extraordinary run of survival, that almost supernatural ability to walk through gunfire and come out the other side, would finally reach its limit. In June 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy on the far side of Europe, Churchill was given command of a mixed force for an assault on the island of Brač, one of the largest of the Dalmatian islands, held by well-prepared elements of the German 118th Jäger Division. The Jäger, meaning hunter, divisions were light infantry formations, specifically trained and equipped for mountain and rough terrain warfare. They were not garrison troops or second-line units. They were experienced, well-led. They had been given weeks to fortify their positions on the high ground above the island. The operation was codenamed Flounced. Churchill's force was substantial on paper. It included 43 Royal Marine Commando, elements of 40 Royal Marine Commando, a company of the Highland Light Infantry, the Raiding Support Regiment, field artillery, and roughly 1,500 to 1,700 Yugoslav partisans. But the German positions on the high ground, on the slopes of Vidova Gora, the highest peak on any island in the Adriatic, near the military objective, designated Point 622, were heavily mined, strung with deep belts of barbed wire, and defended in depth by troops who knew exactly where every approach route lay and had pre-registered their mortars and machine guns to cover each one. The attack went badly from the start. The partisan contingent failed to reach their assigned objectives. The commandos were forced to advance uphill through dense minefields against prepared defensive positions, taking heavy casualties with every metre gained. The commanding officer of 40 Royal Marine Commando, Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Manners, who held the DSO, was killed during the assault. Of the assault group that finally reached the German defensive line on the hilltop, only Churchill and 6 others made it to the objective. Then a mortar round landed among them. It killed or wounded every man around Churchill. He was alone, on a hilltop strewn with the bodies of his own men, with German soldiers closing in from 3 directions. There was nothing tactical left to do. There were no reinforcements coming. There was no avenue of withdrawal. He picked up his bagpipes and began to play. The tune this time was not March of the Cameron Men, it was Will Ye Know Come Back Again, a Jacobite lament about the exile of Bonnie Prince Charlie. It is a song about loss and longing and the desperate, defiant hope of return. He played it there on the hilltop, alone among the dead and dying, until German grenades exploded around him and the blast knocked him unconscious. When he woke, he was a prisoner of war. The Germans, discovering among their captives a British officer with the surname Churchill, immediately assumed he must be related to the Prime Minister. He was not. But that assumption, that error of identification, almost certainly saved his life. Instead of being sent to an ordinary prisoner of war camp, Churchill was flown to Berlin for interrogation by German intelligence and then transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, located north of the German capital. Sachsenhausen was not an ordinary camp. It was one of the original Nazi concentration camps, established in 1936 just north of Berlin, and within its perimeter was a special compound, the Sonderlager, reserved for prisoners whom the German High Command considered politically significant or potentially useful for future negotiations or prisoner exchanges. The compound was separate from the main camp, with its own guards, its own fencing, and its own security protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of thing that Churchill and his fellow inmates immediately began planning. Churchill found himself in the company of some of the most remarkable prisoners in German hands. Among them were several veterans of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, the mass breakout from an RAF prisoner of war camp that had taken place in March 1944 and had resulted in the murder of 50 recaptured officers on Hitler's direct orders. The survivors of that catastrophe included Flight Lieutenant Bertram James, a pilot who had already escaped and been recaptured multiple times before, Wing Commander Harry Day, Major Johnny Dodge, who was connected to Winston Churchill by marriage, and Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowse. These were men who had already demonstrated, at enormous personal risk and at the cost of their comrades' lives, that they regarded captivity as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. Churchill fit in with them immediately. They were his kind of people. On the night of September the 23rd, 1944, Churchill and James, along with several other prisoners from the Sonderlager, broke out of Sachsenhausen through a tunnel. The tunnel had been dug beneath one of the barracks buildings and extended over 100 feet to a point beyond the perimeter wire, and the guard towers clearing the outer security zone that surrounded the compound. The work had taken weeks. The dirt had been dispersed in the time-honoured manner of escape tunnels, concealed in trouser legs and scattered across exercise yards. The engineering was crude, but it held. Churchill and James emerged into the darkness outside the camp, oriented themselves by the stars, and headed north toward the Baltic coast, roughly 100 miles away, moving on foot through the forests and fields of northeastern Germany. They travelled for close to 2 weeks, hitching rides in goods, wagons on freight trains, walking through the night, scrounging food where they could find it. They got within reach of the coast, close enough to begin planning how they might steal a boat and cross to Sweden. Then, exhausted, they made the mistake of falling asleep in a barn near the town of Rostock. They were marched back to Sachsenhausen and locked in the punishment block. Most men, at this point having been caught, returned to a concentration camp and placed in solitary confinement, would have accepted that the situation was beyond their control and settled in to wait for liberation. Churchill, as he had demonstrated repeatedly across 4 years of war, was not most men. In late April 1945, with the Soviet armies smashing their way toward Berlin from the east, the SS decided to evacuate Sachsenhausen's special prisoners southward. Churchill and approximately 140 others were loaded onto trucks and driven toward the Austrian Tyrol. The journey was chaotic. The roads were choked with refugees, deserters, and retreating German units. The SS guards were nervous, unpredictable, and increasingly aware that the war was lost. The prisoners, particularly those who had been in German captivity for years, understood with cold clarity that an SS escort in the final days of a collapsing regime was not protection. It was a death warrant. If the SS decided these prisoners were more useful dead than alive, there would be no appeal and no witnesses. Near the village of Niederdorf in the South Tyrol, the situation reached a crisis. The convoy halted. Among the prisoners were former prime ministers, generals, intelligence agents, and relatives of men who had attempted to assassinate Hitler. A delegation of the most senior captives decided to act, so they made contact with regular Wehrmacht officers in the area and explained the situation plainly. The prisoners feared summary execution. They needed the regular army to intervene against the SS. A Wehrmacht unit, commanded by Captain Richard von Alvensleben, regular army officer who apparently decided that his duty to the laws of war and to basic human decency outweighed whatever remained of the collapsing chain of command, assessed the situation and moved his men into position around the prisoners. The outnumbered SS guards, faced with the prospect of fighting regular German soldiers over prisoners they could not justify killing, chose to withdraw. Churchill was free, but free in the middle of the Austrian Alps in late April, with snow still on the passes, no map, no communications equipment, no transport, no rations beyond whatever he could scavenge, and no clear idea of how far away the nearest Allied forces were or in which direction they lay. So he did the thing that had defined his entire life, in peace and in war. He acted, he chose a direction. He started walking. He headed south alone, through the mountain passes of the Tyrol, sleeping rough in shepherds' huts and barns, eating whatever he could find or persuade the local population to give him. He covered approximately 150 kilometres of alpine terrain across some of the most rugged country in Europe, before he reached the outskirts of Verona in northern Italy, where he walked into an American armoured column. The war, for him, was finally over. Except that it was not over. Not for Jack Churchill. The war in the Pacific was still raging. Japan had not surrendered. Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the islands of the Pacific itself, were still held by Japanese forces who showed no sign of giving up. Churchill was assigned to the Far East as second-in-command of 3rd Commander Brigade, which was preparing for operations against Japan. He was on his way, eager, ready-armed, presumably with the same broadsword that had been his companion across half of Europe. Then the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered. The war was truly and irrevocably over. Churchill's reaction, according to every account, was entirely in character. If it was not for those damn Yanks, he said, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. He was not joking. Or if he was, nobody who knew him was entirely confident about which part was the joke, and which part was the honest disappointment of a man who had finally found the thing he was made for, and then had it taken away. The war was finished, but Jack Churchill was not finished being Jack Churchill. His post-war career was in its own way as remarkable as his wartime service. It revealed that the man who had charged machine gun nests with a broadsword was not performing a role. He was not playing a character created by the war. He was simply being himself, in peace as in war, with exactly the same intensity, exactly the same defiance of convention, and exactly the same bewildering appetite for doing things that no reasonable person would consider doing. He qualified as a military parachutist, making his first jump on his 40th birthday, because apparently the normal way of entering a 40th year on Earth did not involve enough falling from airplanes for his taste. He then commanded the 5th Scottish Parachute Battalion, making him, so far as anyone has been able to determine, the only officer in the history of the British Army to have commanded both a commando unit and a parachute battalion, two of the most physically demanding and tactically aggressive formations the army possessed. He transferred to the Seaforth Highlanders and then to the Highland Light Infantry, serving as second-in-command of the 1st Battalion in Palestine during the violent, complex and morally exhausting final years of the British Mandate, when British forces were caught between Jewish paramilitaries, Arab militias, and an impossible political situation that no amount of military force could resolve. In Jerusalem, during one of the most dangerous periods of the entire Mandate, Churchill was involved in the response to the Hadassah medical convoy ambush on April 13, 1948, when a convoy carrying doctors, nurses, and university staff was attacked on the road to Mount Scopus. The attack killed 78 people. Churchill helped coordinate the evacuation of several hundred patients and medical staff from Hadassah Hospital in the aftermath. At one point, he was observed walking calmly toward an active ambush site, carrying nothing but a blackthorn walking stick. When someone pointed out that he might want a weapon, he replied, "People are less likely to shoot you if you smile at them." After Palestine, he was posted to Australia as chief instructor at the Land and Air Warfare School, where he discovered surfing and became, with characteristic immediacy, entirely obsessed. He built himself a surfboard, a great plank of wood somewhere between 14 and 16 feet long, depending on which account you believe, and began riding waves on the Australian coast with the same manic dedication he had brought to the bagpipes, the longbow, and the business of fighting the Germans with a broadsword. When he returned to England, the obsession came with him. On July the 21st, 1955, he became the first person known to have surfed a tidal bore anywhere in the world when he rode the Severn Bore at Stonebench in Gloucestershire, standing on his homemade board as the wave rolled up the river for over a mile. He retired from the army in 1959. In retirement, he bought and lovingly restored coal-fired steamboats, which he sailed on the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He built and sold radio-controlled model warships. He entered motorcycle speed trials, and every evening, on his commuter train home from London, he threw his briefcase out of the carriage window. He had calculated the precise point on the line where the train passed his back garden, and he tossed the briefcase so that it landed in his garden, saving him the trouble of carrying it on the walk from the station. His fellow commuters reportedly found this alarming the first time they witnessed it and entirely unremarkable after the 20th. He had married Rosamond Margaret Denny, daughter of the Scottish shipbuilder Sir Maurice Denny, on March the 8th, 1941, at St. Augustine's Church in Dumbarton. They had 2 sons, Malcolm and Rodney. He died on March the 8th, 1996, on his 55th wedding anniversary, at the age of 89. There is a temptation, when telling the story of Mad Jack Churchill, to reduce him to a comic figure, the funny, eccentric with the sword, the mad Englishman who went to war with a medieval weapon and somehow got away with it. People laugh when they hear the stories. They shake their heads. They file him under amusing wartime characters and move on. That reading misses the point entirely. Churchill's combat record is not an anecdote or a footnote or a piece of colourful regimental history. It is one of the most decorated and operationally significant commando careers of the entire Second World War. The Distinguished Service Order and Bar, the Military Cross, 42 prisoners taken in a single night with 1 corporal, an entire German island garrison destroyed at Alta, sustained combat leadership across 4 theatres of war, from the fields of France to the mountains of Yugoslavia. These are not the achievements of a man playing dress-up. These are the achievements of a man who understood something about the nature of combat that most of his contemporaries either did not see or saw, but did not have the courage to act on. What Churchill grasped, and what he proved in action, from L'Épinette to Vågsøy to Pigoletti to the hilltop on Brač, where he sat alone among the dead, playing a Jacobite lament on the bagpipes, was that warfare is never purely mechanical. It is not only about who has the bigger gun, or the larger battalion, or the better position on the map. It is, at its deepest foundation, a contest between human minds. And a human mind, no matter how thoroughly trained, no matter how tightly disciplined, has a specific vulnerability. It assumes the enemy will behave in recognizable ways. It assumes the enemy will carry the expected weapons, and use the expected tactics, and conform to the framework that training has carefully built. When the enemy steps outside that framework, when he does something genuinely inexplicable, something that the defending mind has no category for, it creates a disruption out of all proportion to the physical threat. A basket-hilted broadsword cannot outperform a Schmeisser submachine gun in any measurable test. Bagpipes cannot deflect a mortar round. But the man carrying the sword, playing the pipes, does something that the man with the submachine gun and the mortar cannot do. He shatters the enemy's model of what is happening. He forces the opposing mind to hesitate, to recalculate, to ask a question it was never trained to answer, and in that hesitation, however brief, the initiative shifts. Churchill did not carry those weapons because he had lost his mind. He carried them because they gave him an advantage that no standard-issue weapon in any army's arsenal could replicate. They were instruments of calculated psychological disruption, wielded by a man who understood, decades before the phrase entered military vocabulary, that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is the one the enemy does not expect and cannot explain. He was asked once, years after the war, why he had carried a sword into battle against an army equipped with tanks and artillery and machine guns and dive bombers and every other instrument of industrialized killing that the 20th century had managed to produce. His answer has been repeated in every account of his life ever written. Every man who served with him recognized it instantly as the authentic and unimprovable voice of the man they had followed into fire. Any officer who goes into action without his sword, he said, is improperly dressed. He meant it. That is the part that people miss. He was not delivering a punchline, he was stating a belief. A man should go to war, properly equipped, and for John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, proper equipment included a Scottish broadsword, a set of Highland bagpipes, and the absolute refusal, maintained through 6 years of global war and for every day of the 51 years of peace that followed, to do anything the way everyone else was doing it. He was 89 years old when he died. He had surfed tidal bores. He had thrown his briefcase out of train windows. He had played the pipes on a burning hilltop in Yugoslavia while his men lay dead around him. He had walked 150 kilometres through the Alps with nothing but the clothes on his back and the certainty that he would get where he was going because he had decided to get there. He had carried a sword into the largest mechanized war in human history and used it not as a symbol, as a weapon. They do not make them like that anymore. If they are honest, they will admit they never quite made them like that in the first place. There was only one Mad Jack Churchill, and he was, from first to last, exactly who he intended to be.